Hello everybody, welcome back to the channel. So today we will be continuing with Clockwork Angel by Cassandra Clare. And by today I mean 11, the 6th of November. And that's because I'm going to be posting this at a later date. I pre-record all of my read-alouds and I post them at later dates, which allows me to upload my content onto the channel a lot faster, and also because I get more enjoyment out of reading the book and I get to spend more time with it, actually, that way. Instead of forcing myself to read a chapter a day, I can read multiple chapters in one day and post them all once the day that I want to post them. So overall, that's basically how I've been doing it ever since my Twilight read-alouds. So there you go. We're going to be reading Clockwork Angel by Cassandra Clare. And of course, I have to put the disclaimer out there that I don't own any of the text, nor am I trying to present any of the text as my own. This is all a read-aloud I'm doing on this channel for entertainment purposes, and everything is in fair use. And of course, everything in the Shadowhunters Chronicles is owned by Cassandra Clare. So this is Clockwork Angel by Cassandra Clare, Chapter 3, The Institute. Love, hope, fear, faith. These make humanity. These are its sign and note and character. Robert Browning, Paracelsus. In the dream, Tessa lay once again tied to the narrow brass bed in the dark house. The sisters leaned over her, clacking pairs of long knitting needles and laughing in shrill, high-pitched voices. As Tessa watched, their features changed, their eyes sinking into their heads, their hair falling out, and stitches appearing across their lips, sewing them shut. Tessa shrieked voicelessly, but they did not seem to hear. The sisters vanished entirely then, and Aunt Harriet was standing over Tessa, her face flushed with fever as it had been during the terrible illness that had taken her. She looked at Tessa with great sadness. "I tried," she said. "I tried to love you. But it isn't easy to love a child that isn't human in the least." Not human?" said an unfamiliar female voice. "Well, if she isn't human, Enoch, what is she?" The voice sharpened in impatience. "What do you mean you don't know? Everyone's something. This girl can't be nothing at all." Tessa woke with a cry, her eyes flying open, and found herself staring at shadows. Darkness clustered about her thickly. She could barely hear the murmur of voices through her panic, and struggled into a sitting position, kicking away blankets and pillows. Dimly, she recognized that the blanket was thick and heavy, not the thin braided one that belonged to the dark house. She was in a bed, just as she had dreamed, in a great stone room, and there was hardly any light. She heard the rasp of her own breath as she turned, and a scream forced its way out of her throat. The face from her nightmare hovered in the darkness before her, a great white moon of a face, its head shaved bald, smooth as marble. Where the eyes should have been, there were only indentations in the flesh, not as if the eyes had been ripped out, but as if they had never been grown there at all. The lips were banded with black stitches, the face scrawled with black marks like the ones on Will's skin, though these looked as if they had been cut there with knives. She screamed again and scrabbled backward, half falling off the bed. She hit the cold stone floor, and the fabric of the white nightdress she was wearing, someone must have put it on her while she was unconscious, ripped at the hem as she scrambled to her feet. "Miss Gray?" Someone was calling her name, but in her panic, she knew only that the voice was unfamiliar. The speaker was not the monster who stood staring at her from the bedside, its scarred face impassive. It had not moved when she did, and though it showed no signs of pursuing her, she began to back away carefully, feeling behind herself for a door. The room was so dim, she could see only that it was roughly oval, the walls and floor all of stone. The ceiling was high enough to be in black shadow, and there were long windows across the opposite wall, the sort of arched windows that might have belonged in a church. Very little light filtered through them. It looked as if the sky outside was dark. "Teresa Gray?" She found the door, the metal handle. Turning, she seized on it thankfully and pulled, but nothing happened. A sob rose up in her throat. "Miss Gray!" the voice said again, and suddenly the room was flooded with light. a sharp white silver light that she recognized. "Miss Grey, I am sorry. It was not our intention to frighten you." The voice was a woman's, still unfamiliar, but youthful and concerned. "Miss Grey, please." Tessa turned slowly and put her back against the door. She could see clearly now. She was in a stone room whose central focus was a large four-poster bed, its velvet coverlet now rocked and hanging sideways where she had dragged it off the mattress. Tapestry curtains were pulled back, and there was an elegant tapestry rug on the otherwise bare floor. In fact, the room itself was fairly bare. There were no pictures or photographs hanging on the wall, no ornaments cluttering the surfaces of the dark wood furniture. 2 chairs stood facing each other near the bed, with a small tea table between them. A Chinese screen in one corner of the room hid what were probably a bathtub and washstand. Beside the bed stood a tall man who wore robes like a monk's, of a long, coarse, parchment-colored material. Red-brown runes encircled the cuffs and hem. He carried a silver staff, its head carved in the shape of an angel and runes decorating its length. The hood of his robe was down, leaving bare his scarred, white, blinded face. Beside him stood a very small woman, almost child-sized, with thick brown hair knotted at the nape of her neck and a neat, clever little face, with bright, dark eyes like a bird's. She wasn't pretty exactly, but there was a calm, kindly look on her face that made the ache of panic in Tessa's stomach ease slightly, though she couldn't have said exactly why. In her hand she held a glowing white stone like the one Will had held at the dark house. Its light blazed out between her fingers, illuminating the room. "Miss Grey," she said, "I am Charlotte Branwell, head of the London Institute, and this beside me is Brother Enoch." "What kind of monster is he?" Tessa whispered. Brother Enoch said nothing. He was entirely expressionless. "I know there are monsters on this earth," said Tessa. "You cannot tell me otherwise. I have seen them." "I would not want to tell you otherwise," said Mrs. Branwell. "If the world were not full of monsters, there would be no need for shadow hunters." Shadow hunter! What the Dark Sisters had called Will Herondale. "Will! Will was with me," said Tessa, her voice shaking. "In the cellars. Will said—" She broke off and cringed inwardly. She should not have called Will by his Christian name. It implied an intimacy between them that did not exist. "Where is Mr. Herondale?" "He's here," Mrs. Branwell said calmly. "In the Institute." "Did he bring me here as well?" Tessa whispered. "Yes, but there is no need to look betrayed, Miss Grey. You had struck your head quite hard, and Will was concerned about you. Brother Enoch, though his looks might frighten you, is a skilled practitioner of medicine. He has determined that your head injury is slight, and in the main you are suffering from shock and nervous anxiety. In fact, it might be for the best if you sat down now. Hovering barefoot by the door like that will only give you a chill. And you do look a little good." "You mean because I can't run?" Tessa said, licking her dry lips. "I can't get away." "If you demand to get away, as you put it, after we have talked, I will let you go," said Mrs. Branwell. "The Nephilim do not trap downworlders under duress. The Accords forbid it." "The Accords?" Mrs. Branwell hesitated, then turned to Brother Enoch and said something to him in a low voice. Much to Tessa's relief, he drew up the hood of his parchment-colored robes, hiding his face. A moment later he was moving toward Tessa. She stepped back hurriedly, and he opened the door, pausing only for a moment on the threshold. In that moment he spoke to Tessa, or perhaps spoke was not the word for it. She heard his voice inside her head, rather than outside it. "You are Eidolon, Teresa Grey, shape-changer, but not a sort that is familiar to me. There is no demon's mark on you. Shape-changer! He knew what she was! She stared at him, her heart pounding, as he went through the door and closed it behind him. Tessa knew somehow that if she were to run to the door and try the handle, she would once again find it locked. But the urge to escape had left her. Her knees felt as if they had turned to water. She sank down in one of the large chairs by the bed. "What is it?" Mrs. Branwell asked, moving to sit in the chair opposite Tessa's. Her dress hung so loosely on her small frame it was impossible to tell if she wore a corset beneath it. and the bones in her small wrists were like a child's. What did he say to you? Tessa shook her head, gripping her hands together in her lap so that Mrs. Bronwell could not see her fingers trembling. Mrs. Bronwell looked at her keenly. First, she said, please call me Charlotte, Miss Grey. Everyone in the Institute does. We Shadowhunters are not so formal as most. Tessa nodded, feeling her cheeks flush. It was hard to tell how old Charlotte was. She was so small that she looked quite young indeed, but her air of authority made her seem older, old enough that the idea of calling her by her Christian name seemed very odd. Still, as Aunt Harriet would have said, when in Rome, Charlotte, Tessa said experimentally. With a smile, Mrs. Bronwell, Charlotte, leaned back slightly in her chair, and Tessa saw with some surprise that she had dark tattoos. A woman with tattoos! Her marks were like the ones Will bore, visible on her wrists below the tight cuffs of her dress, with one like an eye on the back of her left hand. Second, let me tell you what I already know about you, Theresa Grey. She spoke in the same calm tone she'd had before, but her eyes, though still kind, were sharp as pins. You're American. You came here from New York because you were following your brother, who had sent you a steamship ticket. His name is Nathaniel. Tessa sat frozen. How do you know all this? I know that Will found you in the Dark Sister's house, Charlotte said. I know that you claimed someone named the Magister was coming for you. I know that you have no idea who the Magister is. And I know that in a battle with the Dark Sisters, you were rendered unconscious and brought here. Charlotte's words were like a key unlocking a door. Suddenly Tessa remembered running with Will down the corridor, remembered the metal doors in the room full of blood on the other side, remembered Mrs. Black, her head severed, remembered Will flinging his knife. Mrs. Black, she whispered. Dead, said Charlotte. Very. She settled her shoulders against the back of the chair. She was so slight that the chair rose up high above her, as if she were a child sitting in a parent's chair. And Mrs. Dark? Gone. We searched the whole house, and the nearby area, but found no trace of her. The whole house? Tessa's voice shook, very slightly. And there was no one in it? No one else alive or dead? We did not find your brother, Miss Grey, Charlotte said. Her tone was gentle. Not in the house, nor in any of the surrounding buildings. You were looking for him? Tessa was bewildered. We did not find him, Charlotte said again. But we did find your letters. My letters? The letters you wrote to your brother and never sent, said Charlotte. Folded under your mattress. You read them? We had to read them, said Charlotte in the same gentle tone. I apologize for that. It is not often that we bring a downworlder into the Institute, or anyone who is not a Shadowhunter. It represents a great risk to us. We had to know that you were not a danger. Tessa turned her head to the side. There was something horribly violating about the stranger having read her inmost thoughts, all the dreams and hopes and fears she'd poured forth, not thinking anyone would ever see them. The backs of her eyes stung. Tears were threatening, and she willed them back, furious with herself, with everything. You're trying not to cry, Charlotte said. I know that when I do that myself, it sometimes helps to look at a bright light directly. Try the witch light. Tessa moved her gaze to the stone in Charlotte's hand and gazed at it fixedly. The glow of it swelled up in front of her, eyes like an expanding sun. So, she said, fighting past the tightness in her throat, you have decided I'm not a danger, then? Perhaps only to yourself, said Charlotte. A power such as yours, the power of shape-shifting. It is no wonder the Dark Sisters wanted to get their hands on you. Others will as well. Like you do? Tessa said. Or are you going to pretend that you've let me into your precious institute simply out of charity? A look of hurt flashed across Charlotte's face. It was brief, but it was real, and it did more to convince Tessa that she might have been wrong about Charlotte than anything the other woman could have said. It is not charity, she said. It is my vocation. Our vocation. Tessa simply looked at her blankly. Perhaps, Charlotte said, it would be better if I explained to you what we are, and what we do. Nephilim, said Tessa. That's what the Dark Sisters called Mr. Herondale. She pointed at the dark markings on Charlotte's hand. You're one as well, aren't you? Is that why you have those markings? Charlotte nodded. I am one of the Nephilim, the Shadowhunters. We are a race, if you will, of people with special abilities. We are stronger and swifter than most humans. We're able to conceal ourselves with magics called glamours, and we are especially skilled at killing demons. Demons? You mean like Satan? Demons are evil creatures. They travel great distances to come to this world and feed upon it. They would ravage it into ashes and destroy its inhabitants if we did not prevent it. Her voice was intent. As it is the job of the human police to protect the citizenry of this city from one another, it is our job to protect them from demons and other supernatural dangers. When there are crimes that affect the shadow world, when the law of our world is broken, we must investigate. We are bound by the law. In fact, to make inquiries even into the rumor of covenant law being contravened. Will told you about the dead girl he found in the alley. She was the only body, but there have been other disappearances. Dark rumors of mundane boys and girls vanishing off the city's poorest streets. Using magic to murder human beings is against the law, and therefore a matter for our jurisdiction. Mr. Herondale seems awfully young to be a sort of policeman. Shadowhunters grow up quickly, and Will did not investigate alone. Charlotte didn't sound as if she wished to elaborate. That is not all we do. We safeguard the Covenant law and uphold the Accords, the laws that govern peace among the Downworlders. Will had used that word as well. Downworld? Is that a place? A Downworlder is a being, a person, who is part supernatural in origin. Vampires, werewolves, fairies, warlocks. They are all Downworlders. Tessa stared. Fairies were a children's tale, and vampires the stuff of penny dreadfuls. Those creatures exist? You are a Downworlder, Charlotte said. Brother Enoch confirmed it. We simply don't know of what sort. You see, the kind of magic you can do, your ability, it isn't something an ordinary human being could do. Neither is it something one of us, a shadow hunter, could do. Will thought you were most likely a warlock, which is what I would have guessed myself. But all warlocks have some attribute that marks them as warlocks. Wings, hooves, or webbed toes, or, as you saw in the cause of Mrs. Black, taloned hands. But you're completely human in appearance, and it is clear from your letters that you know, or believe, both of your parents to be human. Human? Tessa stared. Why wouldn't they have been human? Before Charlotte could answer, the door opened, and a slender, dark-haired girl in a white cap and apron came in, carrying a tea tray, which she set down on the table between them. Sophie, Charlotte said, sounding relieved to see the girl. Thank you. This is Miss Gray. She will be a guest of ours this evening. Sophie straightened, turned to Tessa, and bobbed a curtsy. Miss, she said, but the novelty of being curtsied to was lost on Tessa as Sophie raised her head and her full face became visible. She ought to have been very pretty. Her eyes were luminous dark hazel, and her skin smooth, her lips soft and delicately shaped, but a thick, silvery, ridged scar slashed from the left corner of her mouth to her temple, pulling her face sideways and distorting her features into a twisted mask. Tessa tried to hide the shock on her own face, but she could see as Sophie's eyes darkened that it hadn't worked. Sophie, Charlotte said, did you bring in that dark red dress earlier, as I asked? Could you have it brushed and sponged for Tessa? She turned back to Tessa as the maid nodded and went to the wardrobe. I took the liberty of having one of our Jessamine's old dresses made over for you. The clothes you were wearing were ruined. Much obliged, Tessa said stiffly. She hated having to be grateful. The sisters had pretended they were doing her favors, and look how that had turned out. Miss Gray, Charlotte looked at her earnestly. Shadowhunters and Downworlders are not enemies. Our accord may be an uneasy one, but it is my belief that Downworlders are to be trusted, that indeed they hold the key to our eventual success against the demon realms. Is there something I can do to show you that we do not plan to take advantage of you? Tessa took a deep breath. When the Dark Sisters told me about my power, I thought they were mad, she said. And I told them such things didn't exist. Then I thought I was trapped in some sort of nightmare where they did. But then Mr. Herondale came and he knew of magic and had that glowing stone, and I thought, you're someone who might help me. She looked up at Charlotte. But you do not seem to know why I am the way I am, or even what I am. And even if you do not, it can't be difficult to learn how the world truly is, to see it in its true shape and form, Charlotte said. Most human beings never do. Most cannot bear it. But I have read your letters, and I know you are strong, Miss Grey. You have withstood what might have killed another young girl, Downwelder or not. I didn't have a choice. I did it for my brother. They would have murdered him. Some people, Charlotte said, would have let that happen. But I know from reading your own words that you never even considered that. She leaned forward. Have you any idea where your brother is? Do you think he is most likely dead? Tessa sucked in a breath. Mrs. Bronwell? Sophie, who had been attending to the hem of a wine-red dress with a brush, looked up and spoke with a reproachful tone that surprised Tessa. It was not the place of servants to correct their employers. The books she'd read had made that very clear. But Charlotte only looked rueful. Sophie is my good angel, she said. I tend to be a little too blunt. I thought there might be something you knew, something that wasn't in your letters, that might give us knowledge of his whereabouts. Tessa shook her head. The Dark Sisters told me he was imprisoned in a safe location. I assume he is still there, but I have no idea how to find him. Then you should stay here at the Institute until he can be located. I don't want your charity, Tessa said mullishly. I can find another lodging place. It would not be charity. We are bound by our own laws to help and aid Downwelders. To send you away with nowhere to go would break the accords, which are important rules we must abide by. And you wouldn't ask for anything in return? Tessa's voice was bitter. You won't ask me to use my ability? You won't require me to change? If, Charlotte said, you do not wish to use your power, then no, we will not force you to. Though I do believe you yourself might benefit from learning how it might be controlled and used. No! Tessa's cry was so loud that Sophie jumped and dropped her brush. Charlotte glanced over at her and then back at Tessa. She said, As you wish, Miss Grey. There are other ways you could assist us. I'm sure there is much that you know that was not contained in your letters, and in return we could help you to search for your brother. Tessa's head went up. You would do that? You have my word. Charlotte stood up. Neither of them had touched the tea on its tray. Sophie, if you could help Miss Grey dress, then I will bring her in to dinner. Dinner? After hearing such a deal about Nephilim and Downworld and fairies and vampires and demons, the prospect of dinner was almost shocking in its ordinariness. Certainly, it's nearly 7 o'clock. You've already met Will. You can meet everyone else. Perhaps you'll see that we're to be trusted. And with a brisk nod, Charlotte left the room. As the door closed after her, Tessa shook her head mutely. Aunt Harriet had been bossy, but she'd had nothing on Charlotte Bronwell. She has a strict manner, but she's very kind, Sophie said, laying out on the bed the dress Tessa was meant to wear. I've never known anyone with a better heart. Tessa touched the sleeve of the dress with the tip of her finger. It was dark red satin, as Charlotte had said, with black moire ribbon trim around the waist and hem. She had never worn anything so nice. Would you like me to help you get dressed for dinner, miss? Sophie asked. Tessa remembered something Aunt Harriet had always said, that you could know a man not by what his friends said about him, but by how he treated his servants. If Sophie thought Charlotte had a good heart, then perhaps she did. She raised her head. Much obliged, Sophie. I believe I would. Tessa had never had anyone assist her in getting dressed before, other than her aunt. Though Tessa was slender, the dress had clearly been made for a smaller girl, and Sophie had to lace Tessa's stays tightly to make it fit. She clucked under her breath while she did it. Miss Bronwell doesn't believe in tight lacing, she explained. She says it causes nervous headaches and weakness, and a shadow hunter can't afford to be weak. But Miss Jessamine likes the waists of her dresses very small, and she does insist. Well, Tessa said a little breathless, I'm not a shadow hunter anyway. There's that, Sophie agreed, doing up the back of the dress with a clever little button hook. There. What do you think? Tessa looked at herself in the mirror and was taken aback. The dress was too small on her, and had clearly been designed to be fitted closely to the body as it was. It clung almost shockingly to her figure down to the hips, where it swelled into gathers in the back, draped over a modest bustle. The sleeves were turned back, showing frills of champagne lace at the cuffs. She looked older, she thought. Not the tragic scarecrow she had looked in the dark house, but not someone entirely familiar to herself either. What if one of the times I changed when I turned back into myself, I didn't do it quite right? What if this isn't even my true face? The thought sent such a bolt of panic through her that she felt she might faint. You are a little pale, Sophie said, examining Tessa's reflection with a judicious gaze. She didn't appear particularly shocked by the dress's tightness, at least. You could try pinching your cheeks a bit to bring the color. That's what Miss Jessamine does. It was awfully kind of her. Miss Jessamine, I mean, to lend me this dress. Sophie chuckled low in her throat. Miss Jessamine's never worn it. Mrs. Bronwell gave it to her as a gift, but Miss Jessamine said it made her look sallow and tossed it in the back of her wardrobe. Ungrateful, if you ask me. Now go on then and pinch your cheeks a bit. You're pale as milk. Having done so, and having thanked Sophie, Tessa emerged from the bedroom into a long stone corridor. Charlotte was there waiting for her. She set off immediately with Tessa behind her, limping slightly. The black silk shoes, which did not quite fit, were not kind to her bruised feet. Being in the Institute was like being inside a castle, the ceiling disappearing into gloom, the tapestries hanging on the walls. Or at least it was what Tessa imagined the inside of a castle might look like. The tapestries bore repeating motifs of stars, swords, and the same sort of designs she'd seen inked on Will and Charlotte. There was a single repeating image, too, of an angel rising out of a lake, carrying a sword in one hand and a cup in the other. This place used to be a church, Charlotte said, answering Tessa's unasked question. The Church of All Hallows the Less. It burned down during the Great Fire of London. We took over the land after that and built the Institute on the ruins of the old church. It's useful for our purposes to remain on consecrated ground. Don't people think it's odd, you building on the site of an old church like this? Tessa asked, hurrying to keep up. They don't know about it. Mundanes, that's what we call ordinary people, aren't aware of what we do, Charlotte explained. To them, from the outside, the place looks like an empty patch of land. Beyond that, mundanes aren't really very interested in what doesn't affect them directly. She turned to usher Tessa through a door and into a large, brightly lit dining room. Here we are! Tessa stood blinking in the sudden illumination. The room was huge, big enough for a table that could have seated 20 people. An immense gasolier hung down from the ceiling, filling the room with a yellowish glow. Over a sideboard loaded with expensive-looking china, a gilt-framed mirror ran the length of the room. A low glass bowl of white flowers decorated the table's center. Everything was tasteful and very ordinary. There was nothing unusual about the room, nothing that might hint at the nature of the house's occupants. Though the entire long dining table was draped with white linen, only one end was set, with places for 5 people. Only 2 people were already sitting, Will and the fair-haired girl about Tessa's age in a shimmering low-necked gown. They appeared to be studiously ignoring each other. Will looked up in apparent relief when Charlotte and Tessa came in. Will, Charlotte said, you remember Miss Grey? My recollection of her, said Will, is most vivid indeed. He was no longer wearing the odd black clothes he'd been wearing the day before, but an ordinary pair of trousers and a gray jacket and a black velvet collar. With a black velvet collar. The gray made his eyes look bluer than ever. He grinned at Tessa, who felt herself flush and looked quickly away. And Jessamine. Jessie, do look up. Jessie, this is Miss Teresa Grey. Miss Grey, this is Miss Jessamine Lovelace. Oh! Lovelace! Simon's the shadow hunter name that he chose. Oh yeah, George Lovelace's descendant! Oh my god, Jessamine Lovelace! She is the descendant of Simon's roommate from the Shadowhunter Academy, George Lovelace, who ended up dying in battle, and Simon named himself after George. He chose George's Shadowhunter name Lovelace to honor his fallen friend. Oh my god! Oh my god. If Jessamine is kind of even remotely related at all to the Lightwoods, then I can see where Isabel definitely got her taste in clothes from. Oh gosh, no, but I'm gonna find out who married who after I read the final book. So, I'm gonna be in for a surprise! So pleased to meet your acquaintance. Jessamine murmured. Tessa couldn't help staring at her. She was almost ridiculously pretty, what one of Tessa's novels would have called an English rose. All silvery fair hair, soft brown eyes, and creamy complexion. She wore a very bright blue dress and rings on almost every one of her fingers. If she had the same black skin markings that Will and Charlotte did, they weren't visible. Will cast Jessamine a look of plain loathing and turned to Charlotte. Where's your benighted husband, then? Charlotte, taking a seat, gestured for Tessa to sit opposite her, in the chair beside Will. Henry is in his workroom. I've sent Thomas to fetch him. He'll be up in a moment. And Jim? Charlotte's look was warning, but Jim is unwell, was all she said. He's having one of his days. He's always having one of his days. Jessamine sounded disgusted. Tessa was about to inquire as to who Jem might be when Sophie entered, followed by a plump woman of middle age whose gray hair was escaping from a bun at the back of her head. The two of them began to serve food from the sideboard. There was roast pork, potatoes, savory soup, and fluffy dinner rolls with creamy yellow butter. Tessa felt suddenly lightheaded. She had forgotten how hungry she was. She bit into a roll, only to check herself when she saw Jessamine staring. You know, Jessamine said airily, I don't believe I've ever seen a warlock eat before. I suppose you needn't have a band, do you? You can just use magic to make yourself sunder. We don't know for certain that she's a warlock, Jessie, said Will. Jessamine ignored him. Is it dreadful, being so evil? Are you worried you'll go to hell? She leaned closer to Tessa. What do you think the devil's like? Tessa set her fork down. Would you like to meet him? I could summon him up in a trice if you like, being a warlock and all. Will let out a whoop of laughter. Jessamine's eyes narrowed. There's no call to be rude, she began, then broke off as Charlotte sat bolt upright with an astonished shriek. Henry! Henry, oh God. Okay, what the frig did Henry do? What did Henry do? A man was standing in the dining room's arched doorway, a familiar-looking tall man with a shock of ginger hair and hazel eyes. He wore a torn tweed Norfolk jacket over a shockingly bright striped waistcoat. His trousers were covered in what looked peculiarly like coal dust, but none of that was what made Charlotte scream. It was the fact that his left arm appeared to be on fire. His arm is on fire! Oh my God, what the Henry? Oh my God. Okay. Now I know where the Fairchilds get their creativity from. Yeah. As well as the red hair. Henry. Oh, good Lord. Okay, gotta continue. It was the fact that his left arm appeared to be on fire. Little flames licked up his arm from a point above his elbow, releasing tendrils of black smoke. Charlotte, darling, Henry said to his wife, who was staring at him in gape-mouthed horror. Jessamine, beside her, was wide-eyed. Sorry I'm late. You know, I think I might have nearly have the sensor working, Will interrupted. Henry, he said, you're on fire. You do know that, don't you? Oh, yes, Henry said eagerly. The flames were now nearly to his shoulder. I've been working like a man possessed all day. Charlotte, did you hear what I said about the sensor? I can't read that with a straight face. I can't take it. Oh my God. Oh my God. Oh my God. The frig! Okay, continuing. Charlotte dropped her hand from her mouth. Henry! She shrieked. Your arm! Henry glanced down at his arm and his mouth dropped open. Bloody hell! Was all he had time to say before Will, exhibiting a startling presence of mind, stood up, seized the vase of flowers off the table, and hurled the contents over Henry. Sorry. Henry. The flames went out with a faint protesting sizzle, leaving Henry standing soaking wet in the doorway, one sleeve of his jacket blackened and a dozen damp white flowers strewn at his feet. Henry beamed and patted the burnt sleeve of his jacket with a look of satisfaction. You know what this means? Will set the vase down. That you set yourself on fire and didn't even notice? That the flame retardant mixture I developed last week works, Henry said proudly. This material must have been burning for a good 10 minutes, and it isn't even half burned through. He squinted down at his arm. Perhaps I ought to get the other sleeve on fire and see how long... Henry, said Charlotte, who appeared to have recovered from her shock, if you set yourself on fire deliberately, I will institute divorce proceedings. Now sit down and eat your supper and say hello to our guest. She's like, if you set yourself on fire again, I'm getting a divorce. Okay. I think he was partially inspired by Arthur Weasley. Holy shit. Okay. Henry sat, glanced across the table at Tessa, and blinked in surprise. I know you, he said. You bit me! He sounded pleased about it, as if recollecting a pleasant memory they both shared. Charlotte shot a despairing look at her husband. Have you asked Miss Grey about the Pandemonium Club yet? Will asked. The Pandemonium Club. I know the words. They were written on the side of Mrs. Dark's carriage. Tessa said. It's an organization, Charlotte said. A rather old organization of mundanes who have interested themselves in the magical arts. At the meetings they do spells and try to summon up demons and spirits. She sighed. Jessamine snorted. I can't imagine why they bother, she said, messing about with spells and wearing hooded robes and setting little fires. It's ridiculous. Oh, they do more than that, said Will. They're more powerful and downworld than you might think. Many rich and important figures in mundane society are members. That only makes it sillier. Jessamine tossed her hair. They have money and power. Why are they playing around with magic? A good question, said Charlotte. Mundanes who involve themselves in things they know nothing about are likely to meet unpleasant ends. Will shrugged. When I was trying to track down the source of the symbol on that knife gem and I found in the alley, I was directed to the Pandemonium Club. The members of it in turn directed me to the Dark Sisters. It's their symbol, the two serpents. They supervised a set of secret gambling dens frequented by downworlders. They existed to lure mundanes in and track them and trick them into losing all their money in magical games. Then, when the mundanes fell into debt, the Dark Sisters would extort the money back at the ruinous rates. Will looked over at Charlotte. They ran some other businesses as well, most unsavory ones. The house in which they kept Tessa, I have been told, was a downworlder brothel catering to mundanes with unusual tastes. Will, I am not at all sure, Charlotte began dubiously. Humph, Jessamine said. No wonder you were so keen to go there, William. If she had hoped to annoy Will, it didn't work. She might as well not have spoken. For all the attention he paid her, he was looking at Tessa across the table. His eyebrows arched slightly. Have I offended you, Miss Grey? I imagined that after all you've seen, you would not be easily shocked. I am not offended, Mr. Herondale. Despite her words, Tessa felt her cheeks flame. Well-brought-up young ladies didn't know what a brothel was, and certainly wouldn't say that word in mixed company. Murder was one thing, but this, I don't see how it could have been a place like that, she said as firmly as she could. No one ever came or went, and other than the maidservant and the coachman, I never saw anyone else who lived there. No, by the time I got there, it was quite deserted, Will agreed. Clearly, they had decided to suspend business, perhaps in the interests of keeping you isolated. He glanced over at Charlotte. Do you think Miss Grey's brother has the same abilities she does? Is that perhaps why the Dark Sisters captured him in the first place? Tessa interjected, glad for the change of subject. My brother never showed any sign of such a thing, but then neither did I until the Dark Sisters found me. What is your ability? Jessamine demanded. Charlotte won't say. Jessamine! Charlotte scowled at her. I don't believe she has one, Jessamine went on. I think she's simply a little sneak who knows that if we believe she's a downworlder, we'll have to treat her well because of the Accords. Tessa set her jaw. She thought of her Aunt Harriet, saying, don't lose your temper, Tessa, and don't fight with your brother simply because he teases you, but she didn't care. They were all looking at her. Henry with curious hazel eyes, Charlotte with a gaze as sharp as glass, Jessamine with thinly veiled contempt, and Will with cool amusement. What if they all thought what Jessamine thought? What if they all thought she was angling for charity? Aunt Harriet would have hated accepting charity even more than she disapproved of Tessa's temper. It was Will who spoke next, leaning forward to look intensely into her face. You can keep it a secret, he said softly. Bald secrets have their own weight, and it can be a very heavy one. Tessa raised her head. It needn't be a secret, but it would be easier for me to show you than to tell you. Excellent! Henry looked pleased. I enjoy being shown things. Is there anything you require? Like a spirit lamp or... It's not a seance, Henry. It's not a seance, Henry, Charlotte said wearily. She turned to Tessa. You don't need to do this if you don't want to, Miss Gray. Tessa ignored her. Actually, I do require something. She turned to Jessamine. Something of yours, please? A ring or a handkerchief? Jessamine wrinkled her nose. Dear me, it sounds to me rather as if your special power is pickpocketing. Will looked exasperated. Give her the ring, Jessie. You're wearing enough of them. Give her a ring, Jessie. You're wearing enough of them. You give her something then. Jessamine set her chin. No, Tessa said firmly. It must be something of yours. Because of everyone here, you're the closest to me in size and shape. If I transform into tiny Charlotte, this dress will simply fall off me. Tessa thought. She had considered trying to use the dress itself, but since Jessamine had never worn it, Tessa wasn't sure the change would work and didn't want to take any chances. Oh, very well then. Petulantly, Jessamine detached her smallest finger, a ring with a red stone set in it, and passed it across the table to Tessa. This had better be worth the trouble. Oh, it will be. Unsmiling, Tessa put the ring in the palm of her left hand and closed her fingers around it. Then she shut her eyes. It was always the same. Nothing at first. Then the flicker of something at the back of her mind, like someone lighting a candle in a dark room. She groped her way toward it, as the Dark Sisters had taught her. It was hard to strip away the fear and the shyness, but she had done it enough times now to know what to expect. The reaching forward to touch the light at the center of the darkness, the sense of light and enveloping warmth, as if she were drawing a blanket, something thick and heavy, around herself, covering every layer of her own skin, and then the light blazing up and surrounding her, and she was inside it, inside someone else's skin, inside their mind, Jessamine's mind. She was only at the edge of it, her thoughts skimming the surface of Jessamine's like fingers skimming the surface of water. Still, it took her breath away. Tessa had a sudden flashing image of a bright piece of candy with something dark at its center, like a worm at the core of an apple. She felt resentment, bitter hatred, anger, a terrible fierce longing for something. Her eyes flew open. She was still sitting at the table, Jessamine's ring clutched in her hand. Her skin zinged with the sharp pins and needles that always accompanied her transformations. She could feel the oddness that was the different weights of another body, not her own. Could feel the brush of Jessamine's light hair against her shoulders, too thick to be held back by the pins that had clasped Tessa's hair. It had come down around her neck in a pale cascade. By the angel, breathed Charlotte. Tessa looked around the table. They were all staring at her, Charlotte and Henry with their mouths open, Will speechless for once, a glass of water frozen halfway to his lips, and Jessamine was gazing at her in abject horror, like someone who had seen a vision of their own ghost. For a moment, Tessa felt a stab of guilt. It lasted only a moment, though. Slowly, Jessamine lowered her hand from her mouth, her face still very pale. Goodness, my nose is enormous, she exclaimed. Why didn't anyone tell me? Okay, so that was a very fun chapter. We get to meet some very interesting characters. Jessamine, why does she kind of read similarly to Isabel Lightwood in terms of personality? Her personality definitely kind of reads a little bit similar to Izzy in a strange way. Oh, absolutely. But, oh my god, Henry. I couldn't stop laughing at Henry Bronwell because let's be honest, the fact that he was completely unaware that he was on fire, that his entire arm was on fire, and he, like, offered to set himself on fire again to see if he can make more fire retardant fabric. And of course, and then you have Charlotte threatening him with divorce papers if he tries to do that ever again. Like, oh my god, I love it. But I can say that Charlotte's bluntness and her blunt honesty, I definitely do see shades of that in Clary and Jocelyn. You know, the bluntness and, like, how harsh her words are, how she doesn't really think of what comes out of her mouth. That's definitely all Clary there, for sure. But I see little shades of so many characters in these new ones. I see little quirks and personality from the Mortal Instruments characters in these new guys, and I actually kind of like it because they really are their own person, and sure, their mannerisms are similar to the others, but not so similar that they feel like the same character, like you're reading the same person over and over and over again. And that's one thing that I definitely appreciate about the book so far, is Tessa is a very, very different character from Clary. She's a very different kind of female hero. And Will, for sure. I mean, sure, he has Alex looks, but he has Jace's personality in so many ways. But I already know that Will, even though he's going to have his likeness to Jace, he's going to have lots of differences too, and that is the one thing that I appreciate, is that everybody really is their own person, but still, they're ancestors of the previous Mortal Instruments characters, so it's going to be similar but different in so many ways. It's going to be similar but different. But overall, I really, really enjoyed chapter 3. I think this was such a fun chapter to read. It was absolutely hilarious. I loved meeting the different cast of characters, but I cannot wait till when we meet the Lightwoods. That is going to be a treat for me, because the Lightwood family is one of my favorite family bloodlines in the Mortal Instruments universe. So that is it for today. If you guys enjoyed the video, be sure to leave a like on it and also comment down below. And if you're brand new, subscribe. God bless. Happy viewing and have a nice day, guys. See ya.